Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Global Immersion webinar. We're thrilled you're with us, and I know we're logging into Facebook Live as well right now and waiting for that to jump on. My name is John Huckins. I'm the co-founding director of Global Immersion, and as we're signing in, actually, if you, I was going to ask this a bit later, but if you jump right into the comments thread and say your name, where you're calling in from, and if you feel compelled, why are you signing into this webinar? What is it that brought you into this virtual conversation? Would love to hear from you on that. Global Immersion, we're a peacemaking training organization, and we work with people of faith to engage our very divided, conflicted world in restorative ways. We believe that restoration is the mission of God, and that peacemaking is our vocation to participate in that mission with God. And so all of our work, all of our resourcing, all of our training is towards those ends. What are the tools to move through conflict constructively, transformatively, to see it as an opportunity for us as the people of God to embody this bigger picture of restoration that we trust that God is making. So we do that in a variety of ways. One way is virtual training like this in these webinars. And so I want to specifically thank our Embers community. This is a community of monthly funders who make this happen, make free events like this, and many of the other trainings happen. So thank you in advance. And if you want to participate in that community, if you believe in this work, jump in with us in that way, and it would be incredibly helpful. This is part of our Conflicted Allegiance Following Jesus and Election Season webinar series. It's our final one. And the big picture vision for this series of resources has been to offer a really tangible pathway beyond our partisan binaries or our temptation to be apolitical and withdraw from the system altogether. That this pathway of a conflicted allegiance is actually pledging our allegiance to the kingdom of God while leveraging our U.S. citizenship, our blue passports, on behalf of those on the underside of power. And the first week of this 3-week webinar series, we had 2 Christian leaders who engaging the nation state, the systems and structures, out of their core faith convictions as followers of Jesus in very different ways. Father John Deere, from outside the system, being a nonviolent prophetic voice, calling the systems to a better way. And Representative Juan Vargas, from inside the systems, leveraging his influence as a congressman change systems from within. Both, though, with this common trajectory that broken systems that are breaking our neighbors must be dismantled, must be changed, and that we have a responsibility to do that. Last week, we talked about ways that we as Christians inherited a couple ways that are really, at their best, insufficient, at their worst, idolatrous and privileged, about how we engage the nation state, with Randy Miller, Shane Claiborne, and Dr. Reggie Williams talking about the lure of nationalism that many of us can fall victim to from the left and the right, and also this temptation to be apolitical, to withdraw from the system because we're so overwhelmed, or because we say we just talk about Jesus, not about politics, and then we cast a vision for a way forward, this conflicted allegiance vision. Today, we're going to consider the real people that are impacted by our diseased theology every day in the United States, the temptation to fall in these binary camps. And we have to move beyond just looking at this from a 30,000-foot view and enter into the stories of those that are often overlooked as we debate our partisan politics, or we remain privileged and paralyzed in fear because of the hard conversations that may upset our family members or our congregations. We believe that until all are free, none are free. And so this is ultimately a conversation about the liberation both for the oppressed and for the oppressor. And we have to be proximate with those on the underside of power for that, the Spirit to move us towards a better way. So that's where we've been, and that's a bit about where we're headed. A couple announcements, then I want to introduce our friends and panelists to you. Next week, next Thursday at 10 a.m., we have our Conflicted Allegiance workshop. It's like the culmination of all this, and we're consolidating it in a way that's going to offer a really practical pathway to influence for like the next day in your congregation, in your board meetings, around your tables. This is going to be a practiced way of life for us and our families and churches. We have a discount code for everyone that's on this webinar that's getting dropped in there right now. So jump in. It's a limited capacity, so the sooner you do that, the better. As you're listening to Lisa and Karen, again, who I'll introduce you to in a second, drop your questions in the Q&A. We're going to have a little bit of time for Q&A. That's a function at the bottom of your Zoom window. So feel free to do that anytime. We'll do our best to get as many of those we can, also understanding that we probably won't get to all of them. Okay, before I introduce Lisa and Karen, I want us to pause to name something. One, this is a polarized moment, and it's, politics is even more polarized topic than many, and we're all feeling that weight. There is a common thread of anxiety that we're all carrying into every room, and so I want us to actually stop, to take a breath collectively. Any ways that we feel like we're holding our fists ready to fight, I want to invite us to open our hands, to listen longer than feels comfortable, to seek to understand rather than to be understood. Even as we listen, to be willing to change our mind. That's a reflection of a dynamic faith that is always growing as the Spirit invites us into who we're becoming. So as we listen, and maybe as things that trigger you or fire you up or you disagree with, see that as a gift. Ask the question behind the question: what's the source of my frustration or my defensiveness? How is this actually part of my formational journey, such that I can have a more whole understanding of who God is and how I participate in this restorative work? So with that said, Lisa and Karen, it's great to have you both with us. You're going to introduce yourselves here in a second, but Lisa, Sharon Harper is a leader. She's a theologian. She's a mobilizer of all things Jesus and justice. I think, I don't know if you remember this. It was a tragic moment, and also there was this moment of levity. In 2014, we were at a protest after Eric Garner's murder in New York City, and we were marching in the way of the prophets in the Jericho story in silence around the NYPD building, as you remember. And so 6 laps in silence. The only thing you could hear, Lisa had flown in, and the only thing you could hear was her dragging her luggage around. You remember this? You're having to pull, and we're rotating through who's dragging it for each lap. But it was this, like, we can just show up as we are and do the work together. It's a great memory. Karen Gonzalez, yeah, it'll be a fun one to reflect on. Karen is an author, a speaker, an immigrant advocate, immigrant herself, who tells that story and reminding us as Christians to see the humanity, the dignity, the image of God in many of these people who we have been taught not to see because of the systems we've inherited. So your work is a gift, and we are grateful to learn from you and to get proximate to that community through you and your story today. So with that said, Karen, how would you introduce yourself? It's always better than anything I say, and then Lisa jump in after that.
Sure. I usually tell people that I'm a writer, a public theologian, an immigrant advocate, taco enthusiast, most importantly. I was a former public school teacher, and I now work for World Relief, an organization that serves predominantly immigrants and refugees here in the U.S. And I went to Fuller Seminary and actually have some deep connections to some of the same people that Lisa used to know out in California through university. So they were an important part of my formation earlier on. Yeah, and as an immigrant person, it's deeply important to me that people see the humanity in immigrants and refugees and other displaced people before we discuss economics, before we discuss the benefits to the country, that we understand these are our neighbors who are image bearers of God.
I think that for myself, just checking to see if I've muted myself on my microphone. I haven't. For myself, I would introduce myself to say, hello, my name is Lisa Sharon Harper. I am also a public theologian. I am an ancestry enthusiast. I've written several books, and my next book is actually going to be tracing 10 generations of my family's story in search of the nugget to help us to understand how did race break the world and how can we fix it. And I am in that right now. I'm literally in the middle of writing that book right now. And so just finished chapter 3 last night. So that's, I'm like all about that story right now. But the last several years, last decade of my life has been spent on those front lines, really the last 15 years on those front lines. And the way that I understand my work is to present my body as a living sacrifice in the confrontation of the powers that are hell-bent on crushing the image of God on earth. And so it really is, in my understanding and my experience, a confrontation of the kingdom and kingdom of God with the forces of darkness that are warring with God for supremacy. Glad to be with you.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Karen. Okay, this is gonna be good. And I wanna recap, I wanna rename our theological starting point, and then where this conversation lands, and then we're off to the races here. So again, everything that we're talking about, when we talk about being a peacemaking training organization, our starting point is that God's mission, again, is restoration. That's both personal and systemic. You know, this is not just about personal salvation. This is about God actually reshaping and restoring all of the cosmos, all of the systems, all things being made new. And this series of resources has really been targeted on that. How are we peacemakers moving towards the holistic peace that is real in the systems around us that break our neighbors? These are real people in real neighborhoods like each one of us experience. So peacemakers must pursue peace both personally and in systemic ways. Again, crossing country, this paradigm of nationalism is idolatrous. This apolitical, isolated paradigm is privileged and insular. I love that last week Reggie Williams said that there's no such thing as being apolitical. We have to ask the question, who is being crushed in our polis? Polis is simply defined as the ordering of society. Who is being crushed in it? And how are we as followers of Jesus actually helping to liberate, to heal? So the way forward we're talking about is this conflicted allegiance, pledging our allegiance to the kingdom of God without forsaking our obligation to leverage our U.S. citizenship on behalf of those on the underside of power. The last couple of weeks, we've talked a lot about how to do that. Today, we're going to talk about why we do that. There has been a diseased theology that's led to the destruction of many of those on the underside of power. And for me personally, when church leaders ask me, where do I start in pursuing a better way? I often say, interrogate 3 words. White American evangelicalism. White, our relationship to white supremacy. American, our relationship to nationalism. Evangelicalism, our relationship to dogma or over practice. When we examine these, not just hear them and get angry and triggered and run away from them, but to examine them as part of our formational process. None of them are Jesus. They're actually things that have gotten in the way of our ability to see Jesus clearly. And what we found is nothing wakes us up to these blind spots more than story, transformation, and proximity to the impacted community of those that are being broken by our broken systems. I know for me, like the moment this became most 3D to me was when a dear friend of ours called from the streets of Tijuana after being deported, and driving down to sit with her on the sidewalk and weep as she imagined a future without her 5 kids. And to say that, for me to say, I'll pray for you and drive back home with my blue passport was an insufficient faith in the embodiment of privilege. So what does it look like for us to be proximate to the stories of those impacted by our broken systems and say, I will pray for you and I will go back home and give everything I can to dismantle the broken systems that are breaking your family and keeping your family from a future of flourishing. So we aren't here today to agree on everything, but we are here to learn. And this is about critical thinking. It's about curiosity. It's about trusting the Spirit to guide us in this constructive way. That's what peacemaking in and of itself is. So Lisa and Karen are voices of the community of God who are speaking to those of us, many people like myself, who have inherited power in certain ways, just like the prophets of the Hebrew scriptures called out those empowered to repent and return to God. And so we're excited about that. So let's start with Lisa. Why does this conversation matter to you? As a faith leader, in all of the things you described about yourself in this introduction, why does this conversation, why is it personal?
Why is it personal? Well, it's personal because my very first ancestor that was brought to America was an Irish woman who came from, actually she was Scotch Irish, living in Ireland, Scottish, there to help plant plantations for the English in Northern Ireland. And there was an uprising in Ireland, and so she and her husband fled to Maryland, 1682. 5 years later, a ship brought a young man, 17 years old, named Sambo, and that is actually his name. That's a Senegalese name, and it was from the eastern edge of Senegal. It means second son. Sambo was brought on a slave ship and ended up being enslaved in Maryland. They lived just miles apart, fell in love, had an affair, and had a young woman named Fortune. Fortune was born biracial at exactly the time when the race codes were first being formed, probably about the third or fourth iteration of the original race code, which was written in Maryland in 1664. 1662 in Virginia before that, but Maryland just copied Virginia a little and then added their own touch. But because Fortune was born in that context, her entire life and the life of all of her progeny and descendants would be shaped by the laws that crafted the construct that we now call race in America. And because of those laws that were crafted just trying to work out what they considered problems in their society in those days, the problem of the growing population of Black people, because Maryland had, I mean, literally hundreds of people of African descent coming off of slave ships every single day. And so there began to be, and they were then breeding them as well. So then there began to be an explosion of the African population, and white folk got nervous and said, we need to clamp down. We need to clamp down on the racial hierarchy and make it clear who is who. But in a mixed race human being who is both white and Black, they didn't have a category for that. So the very first race laws were created in order to determine slave or free status for mixed race human beings and to stop that. So I don't know if you saw the movie The Loving, which was came out a few years back, about the Supreme Court case that challenged the anti-misogynization laws that had proliferated the South in 17 states at that time. But Loving, those laws go back to the laws that were created in the time of Fortune, my 10 times great-grandmother. And it was those laws that then shaped the course of my entire family's life. So why does this matter? It matters because people with power in America, because we are a democracy, have a vote. And their vote puts in place people who craft laws. And those laws have the ability to bless or to curse. Not just one individual, but an entire generation and every generation that comes after that. Mm-hmm. And so the church, unfortunately, was responsible for managing the enslavement of people in Virginia and in Maryland in the beginning. The church is responsible. And now, today, the church is responsible for how it leads people into this 2020 season where we are once again being called to account for how we believe the polis should live together and what the church decides, because the church makes up the majority of people in the United States of America. What the church decides, who the church decides to elect, will determine the course of my family for the next 10 generations. So that's why I care.
Thanks, Lisa. I see some people asking questions in the chat and raising hands. Drop them in the Q&A as you go. Thank you for your engagement on here. Karen, why is this conversation personal to you?
You know, I'm from Guatemala. I was born there. I lived there till I was 10. My family would never, ever have left Guatemala. It's a beautiful place. It's literally called the country of the eternal spring. But we left because in the 1970s and 80s, the United States funded a civil war in our country. But it goes even beyond that, the reason I speak Spanish, the reason I have a Spanish surname is because indigenous people were colonized, they were raped, they were murdered, they were enslaved. They were seen as savages, ironically, in all of this. And we still suffer from this colonial wound, this internalized oppression. And then on top of that, since the 18th century or late 18th century, we've suffered from over-involvement of the United States. And a lot of the migration that you see out of Central America, that you see out of Mexico, is as a direct result of policies of the United States in those countries. At the macro level, the United States bears a huge responsibility. And so, yes, my uncle and cousins that are still in Guatemala, they can't vote. But many of the Americans that are listening to this webinar that are in the church today can make a difference in the lives of people in Central America who are in extremely vulnerable situations. I see the way that deportations have created a COVID crisis in Guatemala right now. There was a flight that came with 75% of the people tested positive for COVID. And when they asked if the deportation flights could stop during the pandemic, they were told no. And so it further puts the people in my country at risk. And so you see policy and policy over and over again that is often supported by people in the church. And when I saw that Donald Trump was elected, I saw it as an extreme failure of discipleship. And it's the last time that I set foot in an evangelical church community. I just couldn't be a part of that anymore. Wondering, looking at my neighbors side-eye, if they saw me as fully human, if they would see people in my country as fully human and worthy of dignity. And finally I went to El Paso right before the pandemic began, and we all began to shelter in place. I was in El Paso and Juarez, and we crossed the border and met with people who were migrants. And we asked them, what's one thing that you would want people in the United States to know? And they said, we just want people to acknowledge that we're human beings and that our humanity needs to be respected. That's what they asked for. And it's to me, the idea that you would have to ask for that of Christians, of a supposed Christian nation, it's just appalling in every way. And so to me, there is no way to separate these two things. You can't say, well, we're going to address the politics, but we're not going to address the faith that is fueling them, this faith that's been infected with nationalism and xenophobia and a faith that says United States first is not a faith that I want to be a part of. So to me, this conversation is incredibly important. There's a lot at risk for so many of my immigrant neighbors.
Thank you. I think it's important for all of us listening in to acknowledge, like, things I'm hearing out of both of your stories is there was a systemic reality that forcibly displaced members of your family. Lisa, for you, 10 generations ago, and Karen, for you, like you as a 10-year-old moving because of broken systems that displaced family, and you would have never left. And to say that like the systemic reality, I think it's easy for people, again, with power or privilege, to not think it's a real thing. Like I'm not sure I believe in the systemic thing, but what we're hearing are these are human beings and stories that have been impacted by systems that have been destructive, and that the church has sanctioned and endorsed and sustained in many ways. And I know, Adriana, your question is great. What is the church? And that's a big question that we could get into. But we have an opportunity now to say, okay, we are listening. We are hearing the systems that have displaced and broken generations. And what is our invitation now to leverage what is ours and the influence we have on behalf of this community that we're listening to now? So I just want us to mark the gift of this perspective and how that begins to shape us. Let me ask this this first prompt, this next prompt of both of you. And Karen, you can go first. Actually, last week, Brandy Miller, who's amazing, just a theological mind and experience, she says that politics, she defines them as what happens to our bodies through systems. We talked about politics, also the root word being the ordering of society. She said, well, how the society is ordered impacts some bodies more than others, or in different ways. What are the on-the-ground implications of this disease theology of nationalism, of xenophobia, or of just isolating ourselves and in disengaging? Like, what are the implications of that on the broken systems that are breaking our neighbors? What does that look like on the front lines? How does that show up every day?
It's interesting. Somebody asked me recently why it is that liberation theology appeals so much to people who are Black, people who are immigrants, people who are on the margins of society. Why is this theology so appealing? And I said, because liberation theology understands that theology is a response to our lived experience, to our lived reality. And it's very much concerned with power, but not in gaining power, but in how power is impacting the people on the margins, those who are poor, those whose rights are taken away, those whose rights are dismissed in some way. And so this is the reason why there are Latin American liberation theologians and Black liberation theologians. It's a powerful theology for us because we can't ignore what is happening to bodies on the ground. I think about somebody, my mother's family is Afro-Guatemalan, and my great uncle came to the United States in the 1960s and experienced the marginalization of both being a Black man and also of being an immigrant person. And this layered oppression, he couldn't afford to not be involved. He couldn't afford to have a faith that was separated from what was happening to his body, from what was happening to the people in his neighborhood. And it's the very same thing for us. Like, we can't separate these two. There's no privilege of, I told you earlier, I just came from the dentist. And the very first question I was asked was, where are you from? Because we're automatically othered. Automatically, I walked into this space and I was seen as somebody who was not other, who somehow didn't belong. And in a friendly way, they wanted to know where I belonged, right? And so that, to me, is the reason we can't ignore that. I see the impact in my neighborhood. I see the impact in the refugee resettlement program of a faith that's been, I should say, professed faith by this administration, right? By this president, that's been supported by so many white evangelicals. And I know of the flights canceled and of refugees in camps. I know the refugees whose homes burned down last week as that entire camp disappeared. I see the way all of these policies impact real bodies. So there's no way to separate these things. Faith has to speak to both of these things.
Lisa, how would you interact with that?
I go back to the moment when I was writing the Very Good Gospel, and I was writing chapter 2, which is on the vision of Shalom. And I was doing research in order to begin to write. And I was asking the question, who wrote this? Who wrote Genesis 1? Who wrote Genesis, right? So a lot of people, there are a couple of theories about who wrote it. And one of the theories is that Moses wrote it. And the other theory is that it's a company of priests exiting the Babylonian exile. And I did some research on the Babylonian exile. I did some research on the Babylonian creation story. What do you call it? And full disclosure, I believe that it's the priests exiting Babylon, but in a lot of ways, it doesn't really matter, because in either case, whether it was Moses or those priests, whoever wrote Genesis 1 or the whole thing was oppressed while they were writing it. They were coming out of, if it was Moses, coming out of hundreds of years of being enslaved. If it was the priests coming out of Babylon, it wasn't just a trip to Babylon, it was war. It was babies' heads dashed against the rocks in the war that then captured the people in Jerusalem and carted them to this land that was not their own and enslaved them for 70 years. So that is the context of the writing of our text. And then I asked myself, you know, after literally having a time of worship where I realized, you know what, I have never heard this before. I have never heard that the writers of Genesis were enslaved as they were, or just coming out of it as they were writing this. How is that possible? So I started asking, what about the rest of the text? Well, what about Psalms? What about, you know, 1 Corinthians? What about Chronicles? What about Isaiah? And it turns out every single book in the entire Bible, every word written in every book of the Bible was written by someone who was colonized or under the threat of being colonized. Even David and Solomon, who were kings of a dinky little kingdom that kept getting sacked by other empires. They were not kings of an empire. They were kings of a kingdom that was very small and vulnerable. Hence the Babylonian exile. Hence the Roman occupation. And then I flash forward to Jesus and all of the New Testament, and I ask, wait a minute, so that means that all of the New Testament writers, as they were writing all of these words, they were writing them all in the context of being colonized? Well, that changes the way that I read this text, because now I read it with a power analysis. Now I understand it through the lens of how power is moving in this text, as my friend Renee August from South Africa says. You must see the movement of power, because power matters in the scripture. From the very first line, it matters. In the beginning, God. Not the Babylonian gods or the Egyptian gods, but the supreme God. That word supreme is there. The supreme God, that's a power word. So the context of our actual faith is oppression. So when I ask the question of how does our faith apply to the streets, it's for me a no-brainer. How does my faith apply to the question of Black Lives Matter? Well, I believe Jesus would be out there marching with them, rattling, you know, the cages that they're put in, the barriers that are put between them and the buildings and the places that they need to actually send a message that Black lives matter too. Why would Jesus care about that? Because Jesus was a brown, colonized man who was colonized by an explicitly white supremacist empire, Rome, whose philosophers, Aristotle and Plato, were the inventors of the construct of race. Aristotle being the one who coined the term Western supremacy, who believed intrinsically that people who were white were the only full human beings on earth. So when the Roman Empire looked at the body of Jesus, they would not have seen a full human being. They would not have seen someone who matters. So why does this matter? Or how does my understanding of the gospel or my faith intersect with the ground and the people on the ground, I actually think that James Cone said it best, that there is a symbiotic nature between the cross and the lynching tree. The cross was a lynching tree. The lynching tree in America is the cross here. It is the place that absorbs all of the hatred, all of the evil that is exacted by society onto brown and black bodies in order to justify the basic evil, which is the evil of domination and greed. Because all of it really goes back to that, really, isn't it? It's really all about the fear of losing what you have.
Yep.
And it's all about the need to acquire more to gain status.
Yep.
I'll end there.
Thank you. I think that's so critical. One, for those of you who have been part of the series of resources, we've talked about James Cone's book, The God of the Oppressed, is a critical book to read for us to understand the perspective of those on the underside of power, and to do some of this interrogation of how we engage the text, and the ways that we can write ourselves into the text as the protagonist, when in reality, many people like myself in the belly of the empire, at the top of the food chain in so many ways, are the antagonists in the story of God that we read throughout the biblical story. And so what are ways we need to reinterpret, to interrogate our position in how we've read the text, or else we can just perpetuate. We can read the text in a way that allows us to continue to dominate and to hold power and then bless it. And that is when damage happens. So the hermeneutic, the reading that Lisa just offered us, is so critical. James Cone is another great resource in that. I want to go to you, Karen, and then Lisa, if you could keep an eye on Julia's question. I think that's a really good one, and I know you'd have a great answer to it if you see that in the Q&A. So just a preface on that. Karen, what have you seen? There's something profoundly transformative about story and proximity. Like I love the Father Greg Boyle talks about, there is no us and them, there is only us. Talk about collapsing the boundary between us and them. When we move into relationships or proximity with our other, things like the prejudice, the stereotypes, they begin to peel back. And what have you seen as we think about the importance of us engaging systems on behalf of those on the underside of power, when those communities meet, like when people with power meet the plight of that refugee community that you just mentioned who lost their camp in this fire, or meet the family who's navigating employment issues as one of their breadwinners was deported. Like, what happens? What's the power of story and proximity in shaping how we engage as systemic peacemakers?
I would say that really depends. And this is why I say that. Because there's different ways of engaging people. And often what happens when these groups meet, let's say you have a refugee family meeting somebody, from a church, let's say, that's coming alongside to walk with them through the process of resettlement. And what you have is a power disparity. You have a family who's just arrived, who doesn't speak English, who doesn't know the culture, who's probably of a different race or ethnic group. And then you have people, right, with historical power who know all the rules and know what to do. And so I think it's up to those people to decide how they're going to engage. And they could do it as white saviors. They can do it as, oh, let me help you, poor people. Or they can do it, frankly, the way Father Greg Boyle talks about, in kinship and mutuality. So I think that's the thing you have to ask in those relationships. Is there mutuality? Are you learning at the feet of migrants and refugees? Or are you just there to teach them, save them, serve them, but they don't get to serve you as well? They don't get to speak up to you. Something that Father Greg Boyle says that I absolutely love is he says, I don't experience burnout because I experience kinship. These relationships are mutual. They joke around with me, they put me down, just like they joke around with each other, because we're the same. I am not the owner of Homeboy Industries, he says, right? We own this together, right? And so I think that that has to be paid attention to. And I think it just sneaks in very subtle ways. I just remember having a conversation with a woman who was really bothered because she knew a refugee family who had just bought a TV. And I said, okay, do you have a TV? Well, yeah, I have a TV, but they're poor. They shouldn't have a TV. And I said, well, you don't need a TV either. In truth, none of us need a TV. It is just nice to have one sometimes, to Netflix and chill some evenings, right? But the fact that she would ask something of them that she wouldn't of herself, that she thinks she has a right to decide how they should spend their money, to not respect their dignity and their choices. I think when we see real mutual relationships, we will see growth and change. But as long as those relationships between the powerful, right, and those with less power or those with no power, if those relationships aren't mutual, then it's just, you're just perpetuating that system over and over again, which is what you see. I hate it when I talk to people and they tell me, you know, from immigrants, I learned so much from them about resilience and survival. And I'm like, really? That's all? Because we're image bearers of God and we have talents and gifts and skills. And our resilience and survival was born of the worst thing that happened to us. Is that the only thing you see? Are we seen as having less in every way? And so I think this is a dynamic you can bring to every relationship, not just to ones with immigrants and refugees. I see the same thing in the way that people, you know, when I used to be a teacher, and I remember being in a training once where they told us that teenage girls, all of them, no matter what race, background, all of them get pregnant at the same rate. It's just that white girls receive less support to have babies. And so they tend to be the ones who don't carry their babies to term, that they terminate the pregnancies. But the perception of all the teachers in my school was that Black and Latina girls were just immoral. They somehow were doing things that were inappropriate when in fact, all the teenagers were the same. And so I think that's what I would ask people is examine the dynamics of these relationships, examine how much mutuality there is, examine how much you allow yourself to be served, you allow yourself to be talked back to, and you respect people's freedom and individual choices. And then those, I think, are relationships that are beneficial to both, where there's the mutuality of learning.
Yeah, let me ask one more really practical question on that,
Sure.
because I think that's huge. Our friend and colleague, Samuel Perez, lives in Tijuana. He would say, we don't need your charity, we need your solidarity. We don't need you to come drop the handouts. We need you arm in arm doing the work together. And that has been a revolutionary paradigm shift. And it's what you're talking about. If we need to be proximate to the stories of those impacted by broken systems so that we actually leverage our influence, how do we do that in a way that isn't just colonizing, that isn't, oh, I need to go hang out with my migrant neighbor, even though I don't have a relationship with them, so they can give me something? Like, is there ways that we can be proximate without being physically proximate? What are other ways that we can get close enough to the stories to see the impact of broken systems and do something about it without perpetuating the paradigm you just described?
Sure, and I think that's as we're entering narrative stories where you read books, you know, you read Lisa's book, you can enter narratives. And I think it's important too, to just respect and not expect people to share the worst thing that's happened to them with you. And definitely, you don't want to start a relationship. You know, people always ask me this, how do I start relationships with my migrant neighbors? And I said, well, how do you start a relationship with anyone? How do you do that? You know, I used to have a Korean neighbor and I made effort to learn a few words in Korean because I knew that my discomfort meant their comfort. It meant that they would feel at ease, right, if I try to speak their language. But often we come to people on our own terms instead of on theirs. And so I think entering through story, if you're not familiar, I think one of the best things you can do, one, is interrogate. interrogate honestly in the presence of the Holy Spirit what you really have internalized and believe, what you were taught about race, about immigration, about whatever the issue might be that you're of your neighbors, whatever it is that, whatever identity your neighbors possess, what were you taught about that? And be honest with yourself. And then maybe enter into stories. We say, just don't come to people of color just asking questions that you can research yourself on Google, but read, but learn, become aware, and don't just read the one voice of this white pastor that you really respect, but read the stories of actual people on the margins or those in proximity and mutuality and kinship. I learned so much from Father Greg Boyle. I don't live in his context in LA. I live in Baltimore. And so it's a very different experience of life, right? And it's a way for me to enter into that story and learn without, without imposing or harming.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I answers that question.
That's really helpful. Adriana's great question too on other resources. Greg Boyle, Father Greg Boyle has 2 wonderful books that talk a lot about mutuality. It's fleshed out through real life story. Karen's book is The God Who Sees, and we'll drop links in here, and this will be in the follow-up email as well. Read her book. Lisa's book, Very Good Gospel, is critical, and obviously the book she has coming, Karen's also working on one, Are Always to Get Proximate. Julia's question. I know this is like wheelhouse. Okay, I don't feel thrilled about either candidate. Loving neighbor, depending on our social location and how that plays itself out. How do we hold these tensions? What's the way forward as we look towards voting? You, or I can't hear you.
An important thing for us to understand is that in a democracy, you don't have the option not to vote, because your non-vote is a vote. When we have a 2-party system. We don't have a parliament. We have a democracy, a 2-party system, where it really is a zero-sum game, where you have one person will win or the other person will win. Jesus is not on the ticket. Jesus has never run for president in the United States of America and never will. Jesus is not American. How about that, huh? Just take that in for like a second and sit with that. That itself discombobulates some of our thinking, right? But when we look at the way that things are set up, it is set up in a way that does 2 major things. One is that it gives us the ability on the most basic level to exercise what it means to be human in the world. It gives us the ability to exercise dominion, to steward our world. In a democracy, the vote is the most basic way that you have to exercise dominion in a nation. It is the ability to make decisions that impact that nation. The vote matters for that reason. To not vote is to choose to withhold your humanity from the larger community, from the common good. To vote indiscriminately without a thought of the impact on the other is to abdicate the authority that God has given you as a human being to lead in a way, or to engage, to exercise dominion in a way that reflects the kind of dominion that God exercises, because we are created in God's image and likeness. In other words, if we are created in God's image and likeness, then the kind of dominion that we exercise should also be in God's likeness. And what do we see of God's dominion, God's kind of dominion in Genesis 1? We see that it's the kind of dominion that blesses all. It's the kind of dominion that does not seek to dominate, but rather seeks to serve and protect and cultivate, and makes sure beyond all else that the relationships between all things is very good, is overwhelmingly good, is radically good. And those relationships include the relationship between humanity and all of creation and the way things work, the systems that govern us. Because on that first page of the Bible, in the first chapter of the Bible, we see clearly that all did work to bless all. There was no cursing in Genesis 1 or 2. The curse came later when we chose not to serve all, but to serve self. Well, then we came out from underneath the umbrella of God's shalom, and the natural consequences of those stood. We came into the time of domination. And so the vote, our vote as Christians, as people who follow Jesus, is simply another opportunity to love our neighbor and to love the image of God on earth and to exercise the image of God within us, meaning the call and the capacity to exercise dominion, to exercise agency, to make choices that protect, serve, and cultivate our neighbor and the rest of the creation. So how do we do this in a democracy that only has two candidates and neither of them are Jesus? We do this by asking, I do this by asking the question of which candidate and which policies that they are putting forward on the table have the greatest capacity to bless the image of God in the least of these, in those who Jesus names as the least of these: the hungry, the thirsty, the immigrant, the sick, the destitute. That's how I do it. I go to Matthew 25 and I ask the question, how is this candidate's policies working toward the blessing of all of these that Jesus said are members of his family? And Jesus said explicitly, you cannot say that you love me and not love the hungry and the thirsty and the immigrant and the sick and the imprisoned and the destitute. You just can't. It's not possible. And I'll tell you why it's not possible. Because at some point in Jesus's life, Jesus was all of those things. All of them. So when we go to the voting booth, when we think about how the polis should be organized, we need to understand the reality that the polis was originally organized in America, and through our laws and our policies, in order to benefit explicitly one subset of our people group in America, and that was men of European descent. Men of European descent benefited from the race laws economically, socially, politically. Men of European descent benefited from the first immigration laws. Men of European descent benefited from the revoking of voting rights from women just within 1 decade of us becoming the United States of America. That is the struggle of our polis. The struggle of the United States of America is the struggle between who will have the right to exercise dominion here. And we have been pushing and pushing and pushing for greater welcome into the franchise of being fully human in America, into the franchise of making decisions that impact the world. So you, as a Christian, as a Jesus follower, as a follower of that brown, physically brown, politically black man, the God man, you as a follower of Jesus have responsibility in a democracy where you have the ability to cast a vote for the way that the polis is ordered. I believe you have a responsibility to cast that vote for the hungry, for the thirsty, for the sick, for the imprisoned, and for the destitute.
Thank you. That, I hope, friends, is some helpful theological and social and rooted in kingdom value tools for how to engage. You know, it is so critical that we engage on November 3rd, and it's critical that we live that on 4th and 5th and 6th and 7th. So Lisa's giving us some framework for how to punch that ballot, and we live it with our lives every single day, especially because this is only every 4-year thing for president. So that, as kingdom citizens, that's our orientation. But this is one step in that process to leverage what is ours on behalf of those on the underside. Brandy also last week said, the marginalized get to determine when shalom is made real. You talked about voting for the most vulnerable, for the Matthew 25. It's that community that gets to decide when peace has been made real, not just those of us that want to construct a pseudo peace to keep us in power and comfortable. I'm going to name a couple next steps, and then if you each just have a short blessing or commissioning to us, I'll give you a second to think about that as I name these things. There's a few ways to stay connected and to support Lisa and Karen's work that'll be coming in the follow-up email that's also dropped into the chat here. Lisa's website for organization Freedom Road, her book, which has been dropped in there a couple times, The Very Good Gospel, and the Ally virtual tour that's coming up for women, to women on faith, gender, and the future of America. Information on that is there in front of you. Karen, her book, again, The God Who Sees Immigrants, the Bible, and the Journey to Belong. And her website is also there. It looks like Karen-Gonzalez.com. Is that right? The dash is important. Again, thanks to our Embers community who's funding this stuff, making it happen. We encourage you to subscribe. We have exciting news. The Everyday Peacemaking podcast launches on October 5th because we actually believe the stories of everyday peacemakers living this stuff every single moment in all different contexts is contagious. It's the stories we want to inform us, to infect us, to strengthen us, to be part of this mission. And lastly, jump on the virtual workshop next week as the registration is limited. Okay, Karen, let's you kick us off. What's your blessing, your commissioning as you send us into this season as followers of Jesus, leveraging what is ours on behalf of the vulnerable?
Yeah, this call is hard, y'all. Following the God man who was a brown Palestinian who lived his life on the margins and who's on the side of the poor and the oppressed. That is a very hard call. But God is with you when you follow that Jesus, and God loves you deeply, and God will enable you and strengthen you to follow after that Jesus. And it's worth it.
My word for you in these days is that we are entering, and have been in actually for a little bit now, a transition period in our world, not only in the church, but also in America and also in the world. I had a moment where I had an aha not too long ago where I realized that for the very first time in about 1,500 years, people of European descent are looking at a time when they will no longer be the assumed leaders of the world. For the first time in 1,500 years. And it was Pope Nicholas V who wrote that Pontifex Romanus that said that those who are not Christian are not fully human, and the uncivilized don't have the right, the natural right or the spiritual right to rule their own territory. Well, all of this, it's all being questioned now because people of color, people who have lived the last 1,500 years, under the subjugation of the age of colonization, have now finally begun to believe that we too are truly made in the image of God. And there are responses you can have to that. One response is a response of fear and to reject or to hide from it, to violently fight it. But another response is to recognize that there's been something deeply off about the last 1500 years and the age of colonization. It is that the world and the church has operated according to the lie of human hierarchy, and that lie has waged war against God. So I offer the word to you. I offer an opportunity for you to live simply in the likeness of God without striving to be God, and to know that God says that's good. And when you do that, when you lay down your arms, when you lay down the need to control, when you lay down the need to be the ones in power, you will then be able to fall back into the arms of God and experience a level of trust and faith that you have never known. I pray that for you. I pray that for you.
May it be so. Thank you both for offering those blessings and for living them with your lives every day. We are grateful for your work and your witness, and for giving us a portal into it today. So all of you jumping in, thanks for being with us. Expect the follow-up in ways to continue to support and follow the work of these two remarkable women. Thank you all. Much love and peace. Bye-bye.